Hey, what's going on, everybody? So today I'm going to be doing a video about Andrew Bustamante, and it's going to be about why I respectfully disagree with his assessment of how Biden handled the Ukraine war effectively. And this is a very hot topic issue, right? Because let's be real, there is partisan politics at play when it comes to Ukraine, right? So a lot of people will perceive Ukraine as being more symbolic of the democratic establishment, things of that nature, right? So a lot more of your right wing conspiracies are kind of focusing on Ukraine as being the problem, right? Uh, and this has been pushed by everybody, a lot of people in the right wing ecosystem, from Tim Pool to Tucker Carlson, to Elon Musk or whatnot. Kind of Tim Dillon, a comedian, RFK, etc. Pushing the idea that it's unilaterally kind of the West's fault and NATO's fault, and that Zelensky's corrupt. You'll hear stuff that it's a money laundering operation, all these type of things, right? However, on the opposite side, when it comes to Russia's to blame, that's seen as more as being more supportive of the Republican position, right? For various reasons that I've talked about in other videos, right? For a lot of the passive aggressive, or not passive aggressive, but a lot of the unspoken reasons why I think a lot of conservatives want to merge or be on peaceful terms with Russia, which are, let's just be real, sometimes racial, sometimes religious, sometimes cultural, or whatnot, in which they see Russia as a conservative beacon of hope to kind of, you know, uh, stand up against what they see as the decay of liberal decadence and modernity, etc. Right? So I think you have a lot of the conservative culture warriors kind of favoring Russia, and that goes from the far right to even just your milk toast everyday Republican or whatnot, right? Because of a lot of the messaging they're getting from their side of the spectrum and everything. Um, However, that's one of the reasons why I want to make this video is because I think that Andrew Bustamante is smart enough to know this, right? He's smart enough to know the nuance. He's smart enough to know how divided things are, but he has an agenda, right? Everybody has an agenda. His agenda, he's trying to grow his business. He's trying to grow his online presence, credibility, or whatnot, right? I'm sure he's a very competitive person. I mean, I'm sure he's swinging for the park, right? He's swinging for the fences, right? He's trying to be as big, if not bigger, than the Joe Rogans and all that, right? Probably being a competitive person. Why not, right? He probably sees himself as a very smart person who sees a lot of dumb people making a lot of money on YouTube. So why would he not get in on the game too? You know what I'm saying? But the thing about the spaces online that I notice when it comes to special forces, military, a lot of geopolitical analysis, philosophical analysis, comedy, even. A lot of these are kind of more leaning kind of right wing spaces, right? And as a result, they kind of adopt the approach, which they adopt the stance that the United States is kind of to blame. It's kind of what I like to call CIA boogeyman culture that's very prevalent online. And don't get me wrong, I love me a good CIA conspiracy just like anybody else, right? I make videos about them, right? But the thing though is that the only issue with this is particularly when it comes to Generation X and below. I'm a millennial, but Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, right? Is that we kind of have in a way a kind of a not anti-American, but a very critical view of American exceptionalism, power, etc. Because we grew up underneath the follies of those, right? And we see those follies as having come back with blowback theory to kind of like bite us in the ass, basically, right? So when it comes to the stabilization of the world, the Middle East, and refugees, and all the death and destruction, right? We feel that we're kind of to blame, right? So, and that's very well true in many cases. But just because something's true in many cases doesn't mean it's true in all cases. And that's actually a realistic position to have, right? And and I feel that like there's just something going on when it comes to the language I'm hearing from Andrew Bustamante, right? And to me, he's kind of more symbolic of what I consider to be an emergent Generation X realpolitik, which can actually be seen in people like Tulsi Gabbard, can be seen in people like Andrew Bustamante himself, Joe Rogan, or whatnot, where it's like right wing, but it's kind of countercultural to a certain extent. So as a result, it's not as rigid, and it seems kind of iconoclastic and amorphic and ambiguous. In other words, they want the power, but then they also need to be self-critical at the same time. And I think that this is something that resonates with all of us, who are of, the non-baby boomer generation, and everything below to a certain extent, where it's like there's this balance between American exceptionalism and also critiquing the American apparatus and understanding how power works from the fourth estate to whatever. And this is why it's so popular online for people to constantly talk about the Central Intelligence Agency, as if the CIA, even though the CIA is not the only intelligence agency on Earth doing things. You know what I'm saying? But what I feel like is that we have almost a bias now where our first instinct is to say we're wrong in the United States. And I would actually say that's actually could be symbolic of the decline. And don't get me wrong, you should be self-critical. We should be self-critical. But it seems that it's kind of, I'm not saying getting out of control. Okay, like I said, I have not scripted anything that I'm saying. I'm kind of just going off the cuff here a little bit. It's not that things are getting out of control, but I do think that it could pose a threat to the way of life that we take for granted here in the United States, to a certain extent. And even though that may not be the most articulated opening, I might have to come back to that. I just want to play some of this video by Bustamante, and then I'm going to explain why I disagree with him. So I'll shut up and I'll play the video.
Technically, this isn't supposed to be a war between the United States and Russia.
Yep.
What's happening is that every time the United States gets if you remember back in like March, French President Macron came out and said that Biden needs to stop commenting on the conflict. It was shortly after Biden was in Poland and said, "For the love of God, nobody should let this guy reign.
Take him out."
Because what was happening is Biden's like very overt implications of how the United States stood to benefit from this conflict was throwing off NATO's goals. And since then, you saw the French president come in and say, "Biden, back down." You've seen the German chancellor step up and say, we need to create a NATO without the United States military being the biggest force, which is why Germany's doubling down on building their army. Because they're like, we need to be the largest army in Europe so that we can drive NATO. Because right now, the United States drives NATO. And if you look at NATO's charter, guess who can join NATO? European states. Yes, it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The only North Atlantic countries that are allowed into that are not European are Canada and the United States.
Yes.
Right? Even the charter itself says we're open to new people if they're European. So it makes no sense that Europe is basically operating at the behest of whatever the United States chooses to do.
Yeah, we were finding this article because you just mentioned this. This is from 2 days ago in the Kyiv Post, so straight out of Ukraine, where the headline is Zelensky says open to talks with Russia, and the article says exactly what you think it is.
So I understand the Twitter armchair analysts out there who basically want to shit on everybody all the time. I get shit on by them too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Zelensky's changing this or changing that or whatever it's going to be, right? 5 days ago he said this and now he's saying that. That's the nature of conflict.
Yeah.
If you're not a professional soldier, if you're not a professional public servant, you don't understand policy changes, priorities shift. That's just how it works. Same thing's happening on the Russia side. So is it a W to use your terminology, right? And I talked about this with Lex when Lex and I were on the Lex Friedman podcast. While a win doesn't look the way people think it's going to look, right? Your typical uninformed person thinks that a win is going to look like Russia raises their hands and gives up and leaves Ukraine alone. A win is most likely going to look like Russia says, we'll stop here.
Yeah.
And Ukraine says, we'll accept that. And maybe there's a ceasefire. And they've still lost 20% of their territory.
And what does that mean for the world if Russia now has 20% of Ukraine, new 80%
Brother, what does
Ukraine?
it mean? What does it mean for the world if Russia has 100% of Ukraine?
Yeah.
What did it mean for the world on February 23rd before Russia ever invaded Ukraine? It means nothing to the world. Ukraine is not a strategic objective for anybody.
Yeah.
Why do you say that?
This is a Putin. This is a narcissism 101, man. Let me get what I think is mine. Yep. I'm crazy. I'm out of my mind. We seen it on Pennsylvania Avenue 2 or 3 years ago. It's the same shit.
So what? Why are we pumping 100? If that's the case, obviously, like there's a humanitarian crisis there. So I see
we're the leaders of the free world, right? So that's what it comes down to.
Julian, ask yourself the hard question, right? You're asking the hard question right now.
Yeah.
What's the point? What's the point? Why is the United States involved in this? It has nothing to do with Ukraine's independence or sovereignty helping the United States.
Do we own them? Is that part of it? Client state over there?
Even if you did, like, what do you own? You own a poverty-stricken country that's on the verge of a failing democracy. That was before it was invaded. You want to know what you get out of this conflict? The United States gets to practice logistical shipments of large-scale weapons and movements across the world in time for a real battle. You want to know what the United States gets out of it? They get to burn through old surplus weaponry and test experimental weaponry on an active battlefield. Why is that beneficial to the United States? Because our real threat is 7,000 miles away.
Yep.
And if we don't get a chance to practice a protracted war halfway across the globe, then we're going to get caught with our pants down when China invades Taiwan. Because guess how far away China is from Taiwan? Only 80 miles further than Russia was from Ukraine.
Well, according to one China Danny here, Taiwan's a part of China.
Oh.
That's not one China Danny. That's one China Biden, too, I'm pretty
sure. Sleepy Joe's got a big meeting on Tuesday. This will all go away. Don't worry. Don't fret. He's got it under control.
Isn't China already shooting fucking missiles towards Taiwan?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's
Okay, so he says a lot there, right? And he says a lot there. So he's kind of, and that's what I'm saying. He has a naturally pessimistic view, and that sounds right, and that sounds like realpolitik, right? But the the thing about I would consider realpolitik is there's different opinions about realpolitik. Like just because, for example, let's just say he's basically saying that this was all a waste of time. It was just an exercise. It was just about the bottom line in the military industrial complex. And it was just kind of a simulation run for the real fight. And I would say that's kind of true, but also kind of false. Because, first off, the West did gain something. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by the gain something? Sweden and Finland both joined NATO as a result of Russian aggression. So was that just not a palpable gain for the West and NATO and Europe? Whether or not to his statement about whether or not we should even be in it or not, because technically we're not European, right? In that talking point in and of itself, the fact that we're not even supposed to be a part of it, based off of that logic, is kind of Eurosceptic, is kind of anti-NATO to a certain extent, right? Which favors which side of the debate? It favors the Trumpian slightly pro-Russia leaning side, right? And my belief is that the reason, and I said this in other videos, the reason why conservatives want Russia on their side is because they believe some of them believe that they can somehow wean Russia away from China or something like that. Maybe. In other words, Russia is not a real threat. And you hear this by conservative pundits, right? Tucker Carlson will try to make the argument, oh, Russia has the economy of Venezuela, right? They're not even a threat or something. Well, okay. And your point, they just own 20% of Ukraine now, so they are a threat. They're making apologetics for Russia because the real war that they want, notably the conservatives actually really want, is the war with China. Trump is not a pacifist. Trump is doing a geostrategic pivot from the Western front to the Eastern front. And Andrew Bustamante is just trying to boil it down as if our engagement in Europe, our participation in Europe with our European allies to help Ukraine defend itself, which is, of course, about us pushing U.S. power and presence in the region, as a superpower naturally does, because all superpowers are trying to do it. Of course, there's some selfishness on America's side, just like there's selfishness on the Russian, the Chinese, and every other country's side, who's a kind of a emergent superpower. But, making it so, did we get those things that Andrew Bustamante said from this? Absolutely. We absolutely got training and logistics runs. And, now that we've also shifted more troops from Germany to Poland, inching even closer to the eastern flanks on the Western front, because in theory, Russia is west compared to China, right? So to make it sound like this was just some waste in a blunder is totally goofy partisan hack job in order to cater towards an audience that he knows naturally will lean more right wing because of the Roganverse, basically, that's essentially taken over all of YouTube, particularly in your more male dominated spaces, right? Comedy, conspiracy theory culture, CIA, conspiracy culture, all this type of stuff. He knows his audience, Andrew Bustamante. He's literally gives courses about how to manipulate people. You don't think he's not manipulating you? He knows how to play a crowd. And I don't hate on that. But maybe I'll just call it out. Or rather, I'm going to be suspicious of it, right? Everything he says, even if it's good, I will always be suspicious of. Period. But regardless, right? Making it seem like it was just some waste. How was it really a waste? When now Russia essentially lost the Baltic Sea. Finland isn't there, and I know that I don't know, but I guarantee you that Putin is really pissed off about the Finland move because Putin sees the world in very historical terms, right? Because of the inspiration of figures like Alexander Dugin, right? He sees himself as an Alexander Nevsky, Battle of the Ice kind of savior of Russia, right? And Finland gave Russia one of its biggest geostrategic blunders in modern history with the Winter's War, which is, a very famous, battle for all the military lore people out there, right? Everybody knows about, Finnish snipers on skis taking out Soviets and everything like that, right? Now all of a sudden, so for Putin, who operates as if he's returning history to its natural state, in which Russia is seen as a civilization that needs to spread, right? He's just had a checkmate to a certain extent in the Baltics, in which not only so that hurts his perception now, right? In other words, like that probably hurts him more than gaining something. Sure, he gained Crimea, which has been a very, throughout history, Crimean Wars, all this type of stuff has been a big part of history, right? So now he has more of your Black Sea access or what have you, right? But now the Baltics, that's screwed now. Because now Sweden is arming Gotland, right? The island in the Baltics, right? Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, all NATO countries. Finland, now a NATO country. And they kicked Russia's butt in the Winter's War historically, in which Vladimir Putin obsesses over history. So he definitely probably sees that as a loss. And then Norway was already in it. And now we got Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Poland. Who's really losing here? So he's saying it's a blunder. How is it a blunder? I would say that this is going to be more of a blunder by us too quickly negotiating with Putin. Because see, this is the thing, is that both presidents should have kept the pressure up on Russia. So Russia would have been like, crap, Now we know we don't have a person in the White House. Now maybe we need to, shift our way of seeking peace with the West, and maybe we actually might be able to give up more concessions. How Vance and Trump treated Zelensky, the Kremlin basically is, I'm sure, using that all over state media to basically say that Ukraine, you were the naughty little neo-Nazi state. We denazified you. We won. Go suck on it, right? Peace is great. It's the timing in which that peace happens that's the issue now. And honestly, I would say that Trump actually encouraging, enforcing, and pushing more of Europe to reindustrialize and try to, reach maximum military capacity with its suppliers like Rheinmetall and all this. I think that's good. I think that's actually a positive of Trump to a certain extent. There's a method to his madness, right? In other words, you kind of seem unstable, you kind of embarrass the Europeans, you see yourself as unreliable, so therefore they need to stand up for themselves, right? Okay, that's actually kind of a good move to a certain extent. You can debate about the diplomacy of it, and maybe embarrassing our allies or whatever on the national stage and everything like that, which could in theory come back to haunt us to a certain extent. Let's just say they don't want to share intelligence with us now. Let's just say that they decide not to renew a military or black site lease or whatever. Let's just say that they don't want us over their airspace at certain times of the day or something. I don't know. America kind of pushing its allies around can have negative consequences for the United States by retracting our power closer to our borders. Whereas we like to kind of extend our arms out and kind of push the conflict as far away from us as humanly possible. In using our hegemony, using our might to help dictate these situations by being the leaders in the coalitions and everything. So I'm not really understanding where Andrew's coming from when he's saying that this is like a loss. To further my point, right? To further my point, this is right here. So, and then also you notice that the armchair analyst, right? The armchair analyst, right? So therefore, these people are unworthy. They're probably, in other words, they haven't done what I done, so therefore I automatically have more of a say. And to a certain extent, he's kind of right. But that does not necessarily mean that you are not your own subjective bias, Myers-Briggs personality or whatever, who, you know, your life is kind of just your own opinion, forcing itself upon other opinions. That's kind of the struggle of ontology and consciousness and existentialism or whatever, right? But I value his opinion, but I think that he's not including all of the details of it. Because, for example, could the U.S. military defeat Russia and China at the same time? What do you think the Pentagon does all day? They run scenarios, they run exercises in the worst case exercises. What do you think we were doing in the entire Cold War with strategic air command or whatever, where we literally had nuclear bombers in the sky at all times 24/7 for like the entirety of the Cold War? We're constantly running scenarios and playing war games. In the worst war game is a two-front war with Russia and China. So to his point, did we gain some military intelligence and new strategies about the new paradigm of warfare? You know what I'm saying? Absolutely. There's a reason why the FARA, the Future Air Reconnaissance Attack program of the U.S. Army searching for a new helicopter got canceled. Because what was the reason? The generals were saying the emphasis now is on drone warfare when it comes to these kind of like land battles or whatnot. With the Ukrainians now as kind of like leaders in drone warfare expertise. So of course we gained something from it. But to say that like it was a waste of time when really the war planners at the Pentagon had expected that all along. In other words, I don't see it as a blunder. I see it as them actually seeing the vulnerabilities of Russia to see with how much they can get away with. How much life was lost for X amount of land taken. And you know what I'm saying? And it's like, I would say that kind of, it depends on how you view it, but it's kind of a stalemate to a certain extent about who wins if a peace deal with Ukraine is struck right now. Because like I said, NATO and the West just basically just got the Baltics. So now they're even closer to the Arctic Circle and everything. And you hear a lot of things about Arctic warfare as like being a very important part of like the next conflict, right? Because sea lanes are opening up and submarines can get through, yada yada yada. So NATO gained pretty much the North, even though Russia gains access to more of the Crimea, Black Sea region, things of that nature, right? And I've been writing like a little like note, right? Like I call it like my own state of affairs letter, right? And I'll probably do that in another video. But but to me is that it's not a waste. I don't necessarily blame the United States for what happened in Ukraine. And he's making it sound that like Ukraine was it was a failing state that serves no purpose. That's what? Like, do you not understand that the whole impetus of America, and whether I agree with it or not, is about is making new markets, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, yes, like it's not useless. There's people who can buy things, for example, right? They have resources over there, right? Even though they have corruption, just like a lot of states have corruption, doesn't mean that like there's not a tangible benefit to the United States or the West. He just wants to distill it into some sort of very sterile war game exercise in which we kind of wasted our time when the real focus was Asia, when really it wasn't. I guess what I'm arguing is it wasn't a waste of time. It was actually just fighting a larger struggle on one front of the battlefield or whatnot. So yes, so eventually, sure, we can focus on China and everything. However, for the people wanting to go to war with China, which I would say is more in the vein of the conservative camp now, because of the fact that they're communist, right? And let's be real, they're Asian or something, right? This whole fear of like the Asiatic communist or something like that, destroying the classical, Jordan B. Peterson, Kermit the Frog voice, West or something like that, right? There's a lot more fear, interestingly, on China than on Russia. But what's more likely to get us into actual like a true real conflict? The Chinese one, right? So I think that Democrats kind of understand that a little bit. They realize that you focus on the lower hanging fruit first to bleed them as much as possible. Then you worry about the bigger sleeping dragon. You don't just test the sleeping dragon, pump off the brakes, let them recuperate, then do a geostrategic pivot to China. Like it just like I don't. It's one of those things. It's like a balance, right? It's like but there's arguments for both. However, China could have already have invaded Taiwan, but they haven't. Because maybe in a way, it's even though they're saying that, maybe it's not their immediate prerogative right now. So many U.S. supply chains are still in China. No matter how many tariffs Donald Trump puts on China, we're still making the vast majority of stuff in China, and that benefits them and benefits us. Which is actually going to truly start an actual true world war? China or Russia? So which one do you handle first? You handle Russia. Even though the United States is prepared as far as the war games go for both. So actually, one minute, let me pause real quick. Okay, right. So for the people who are more in the anti-China camp, right? There's an interesting this thing I'm showing on my screen in the middle. So it says China supports recent consensus between U.S. and Russia on Ukraine war. Foreign minister says. Why is that? Because Russia and China are allies. They don't want what they would, let's just say if they're in the east, let's just say that they're looking towards the Pacific, right? They don't want their back door necessarily exposed. Russia is what's blocking them. Russia is their Arctic tundra. You know what I'm saying? So of course they want their ally to recoup as quickly as possible. They want and also they probably want those minerals underneath the stolen Ukrainian soil of Donetsk and Luhansk and all those areas. So isn't that interesting? You know what I'm saying? So it's like they actually want the war to stop. Why is that? So if China's our enemy and they want Russia to make peace, if you're one of these in the pro-war China camp, then wouldn't you be suspicious of that to a certain extent, like as a possibility, being suspicious? Like I said, they want Russia to recoup as quickly as possible. They like having the legitimacy that Russia helps give them because they can both vote in line in the UN or whatever against the United States. They can both, do deals with BRIC countries and all this type of stuff in Iran without the United States. They don't want a strong partner necessarily being weakened. And that's what the West was doing. So for the people calling for peace right now, which is great because yes, it will save human life, in theory, you are actually kind of hurting the West in retracting U.S. power, and just I would just say Western power, not even the U.S. power, Western American power from the world stage in a world that's becoming more of a multipolarity from a American hegemony. So that's also interesting. That's an idea that just came into my brain right now. But this is one too. Could the U.S. military defeat Russia and China at the same time? So, like to my point, Andrew, he's making it sound like it was just some sterile waste of time. Well, no, it wasn't. That was a part of the overall strategy of the two front war between the two other superpowers. So this was just a battle. You know what I'm saying? In a larger conflict. And you can almost say that the battle is kind of a stalemate. To my point, because Finland and Sweden joined NATO, even though Russia gains eastern Ukraine and Crimea. But Crimea is only really as good as Turkey, because Turkey is a part of NATO. They have to get through those straits to get down to the Aegean Sea and everything for their submarines. Which is why Turkey, even throughout the duration of the Cold War back in the day, was able to play both sides of the fence. This is why the F-35 contract got canceled with Turkey, because they were literally buying surface-to-air missiles from Russia that were allegedly built to take out F-35s. So we're not giving you our F-35. And we shut down the Turkish F-35 program. And that's the power of America, right? We're able to do those moves. We're able to say, don't talk to those people unless you want our stuff. But the more American power retracts from the world stage, the less we have those bargaining chips, which could actually endanger everybody in the United States. Or, there's so many different angles, right? But, let me do something here real quick. Okay, so let me see something here. So this is from the National Interest. So could the U.S. military defeat Russia and China at the same time? Published in 2001 by Robert Farley. So let me see here. And I remember seeing articles even older than this. So this isn't like some new concept. So here's what you need to know. So such a war is unlikely, but the U.S. should be prepared. The United States discarded its oft misunderstood quote unquote two-war doctrine intended as a template for providing the means to fight two regional wars simultaneously last decade. Designed to deter North Korea from launching a war while the United States was involved in fighting against Iran or Iraq or vice versa, the idea helped give form to the Department of Defense's procurement, logistical, and basing strategies in the post-Cold War, when the United States no longer needed to face down a Soviet threat. The United States backed away from the doctrine because of changes in the international system, including the rising power of China and the proliferation of highly effective terrorist networks. But what if the United States had to fight two wars today, and not against states like North Korea and Iran? What if China and Russia sufficiently coordinated with one another to engage in simultaneous hostilities in the Pacific and Europe? Political coordination. So, could Beijing and Moscow coordinate a pair of crises that would drive two separate military responses? Maybe, but probably not. Each country has its own goals and works on its own timeline. More likely, one of the two would opportunistically take advantage of an existing crisis to further its regional claims. For example, Moscow might well decide to push the Baltic states if the United States became involved in a major skirmish in the South China Sea. So very interesting, right? So do we remember this is 2000 and this is 2021, right? So he was kind of saying, see, so he's arguing that a two front war won't happen, most likely. However, he has it kind of backwards. But in the past though, right? He's kind of saying that Russia and China aren't that close. They'll actually double time each other, and they would use the skirmish of one to benefit the other. But that hasn't actually happened yet in our timeline. You know what I'm saying? Like that actually hasn't happened. Like to our real world, Russia invading Ukraine has not. There are no Chinese boots on the ground in Taiwan. Is it a threat? An ever looming threat? Absolutely. But it's just very interesting, right? How the different scenarios in the past. Anyways, back to the article. So in any case, the war would start on the initiative of either Moscow or Beijing. The United States enjoys the benefits of the status quo in both areas, and generally, at least where great powers are concerned, prefers to use diplomatic and economic means to pursue its political ends. While the U.S. might create the conditions for war, Russia or China would pull the trigger. So, which is kind of, I don't know, maybe, who knows? Who knows now, right? With the second Trump administration. Who knows? So, on the upside, so flexibility. On the upside, only some of the requirements for fighting in Europe and the Pacific overlaps. As was the case in World War II, the U.S. Army would bear the brunt of defending Europe while the Navy would concentrate on the Pacific. The United States Air Force would play a big role in both theaters. Russia lacks the ability to fight NATO in the North Atlantic and probably has no political interest in trying. This means that the United States and its NATO allies can allocate some resources to threatening Russia's maritime space and providing insurance against a Russian naval sortie. The U.S. Navy can concentrate its forces in the Pacific. So I guess what he's kind of saying is that the NATO, when it comes to sea power, NATO, the West, United States kind of win in that regards. And what they're saying is, as a result, we could divert more naval forces to the Pacific, which kind of harkens back to what happened in World War II. But it says Russia lacks the ability to fight NATO in the North Atlantic. So, okay, so I guess I can't necessarily debate with that. So depending on the length of the conflict and the degree of warning provided, the United States could transport considerable U.S. Army assets to Europe to assist with any serious warfighting. The bulk of American carriers, submarines, and surface vessels would concentrate in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, fighting directly against China's A2AD system and sitting astride China's maritime transit lanes. Long-range aviation, including stealth bombers and similar assets, would operate in both theaters as needed. The United States military would be under strong pressure to deliver decisive victory in at least one theater as quickly as possible. This might push the United States to lean heavily in one direction with air, space, cyber assets, hoping to achieve a strategic and political victory that would allow the remainder of its weight to shift to the other theater. Given the strength of U.S. allies in Europe, the United States might actually focus on the conflict in the Pacific. So he's kind of creating an impetus for kind of similar to what we're seeing right now. In other words, a geostrategic shift to China, a geostrategic shift to China away from Europe. And he's already giving kudos to the Europeans for having strong capabilities, even though, interestingly, what you hear from the Trump administration is the exact opposite. They're not doing enough for their militaries. So I think two things can possibly be right. I think they have lethality, but they're not necessarily as equipped to be as mobilized as how, for example, the American industrial military complex works. So maybe what Trump is doing is to kind of, rev up the lawnmower, rev up the engine for Europe to say it's time to get serious, basically. Otherwise, because we're retracting from this space and we're shifting, doing a geostrategic pivot to the Middle East and China. So alliance structure. So U.S. alliance structure in the Pacific differs dramatically from that of Europe, notwithstanding concern over the commitment of specific U.S. allies in Europe. The United States has no reason to fight Russia apart from maintaining the integrity of the NATO alliance. Actually, I'm not sure if that's 100% true, because when it comes to resources like oil and natural gas, which are vital to fighting any war, Russia is the lead exporter of fossil fuels into China. So I would say that yes, is about maintaining the integrity of NATO. But I would also say it is kind of about, by proxy, weakening the other to a certain extent. Because if let's just say some weird alternate history that Ukraine actually just marched into Russia and actually was really doing a crazy job of winning the war, right? Or something like that. And let's just say that the people in Russia got pissed off, Putin, we're done with you, overthrew him, Russia's destabilized, what have you. China doesn't want that. You know what I'm saying? So, because that would force them to rethink a lot of their whole strategy. So, in other words, the more you weaken Russia, by proxy, you weaken China, which is why I think China wants to. They're also supportive of a peace deal. But do you really think that it's a peace deal because they truly want peace, or do they want a timeout to reassess the situation so they can continue to be hostile? So do you give them the timeout? Is the question. And it seems like Republicans and the conservatives and the anti-war people or whatnot, even though they're not truly anti-war, they're just anti-Russian war. They're pro-other wars, I'm sure, a lot of them, if they needed to be. But they're anti this one because of all the bipartisan bickering in our country. That's kind of just created a schizophrenic geopolitic that doesn't know what it wants to be, really. I wish that Democrats and Republicans would just come together and create some unified policy on the situation in which both sides could feel like they're getting ideological incremental gains, even though we're all moving towards the same direction pragmatically in the center. But anyways, right? So if the United States fights, then Germany, France, Poland, and the United Kingdom will follow. So in the most controversial scenarios, even the European allies alone would give NATO a tremendous medium-term advantage over the Russians. Russia might take parts of the Baltics, but it would suffer heavily under NATO air power and likely couldn't hold stolen territory for long. In this context, the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force would largely play support and coordinated roles, giving the NATO allies the advantage they needed to soundly defeat the Russians. The U.S. Nuclear force would provide insurance against a Russian decision to employ tactical or strategic weapons. So actually, that sounds kind of on point to kind of like what would possibly kind of happen, right? It seems like Macron and the other European powers are they're almost kind of creating like a European defense force basically to kind of step up. And Macron's even talking about replacing American nuclear geostrategic nuclear weapons or whatever tactical nuclear weapons with the French ones, which would be a huge deal. That we have American nuclear weapons are in Europe. And what they're saying is that, well, we can replace more French ones. That's a big deal. That would be a huge deal. That would change so many things. So, let's see here. So, the United States faces more difficult problems in the Pacific. So, Japan or India might have an interest in the South China Sea, but this hardly guarantees their participation in the war, or even the degree of benevolence of their neutrality. The alliance structure of any given conflict would depend on the particulars of that conflict. Any of the Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan would become China's primary targets. The rest, U.S. pressure aside, might well prefer to sit on the sidelines. This would put extra pressure on the United States to establish dominance in the Western Pacific with its own assets. And one thing that they're not really talking about is just because everybody talks about China all the time, China hasn't really projected its power outside of its borders. You know what I'm saying? Like, what's the actual equivalent of the Chinese Vietnam War? They haven't had one in modern times. What's the equivalent of the Chinese Iraq Afghanistan wars? They haven't had one. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're looking. And sometimes I feel like we kind of overestimate China a little bit. They're very good when it comes to spying, hacking, stealing information, but it's to be tested if they're really good at projecting force truly outside of their borders. Or is it going to be, I hate to say, the stereotype of just flawed Chinese rip-off, knockoff goods that just can't really hold up in a war? You know what I'm saying? It's like, which makes me think, and I know, and I truly feel that really smart people in our government know this. I think that they look at China as threatening from a per person perspective. Like if we were fighting some land invasion or something, maybe, because there's a billion of them versus 300 million Americans, right? And not all of those people are of war-fighting age or potential. But then again, a lot of the Chinese stuff is just rip-off stuff of the American stuff. Like it's something else is going on here. I think that one of the reasons why conservatives, whether they realize it or not, but I think people like Bustamante might know, why they want to geostrategically shift to Asia is because if they do start a conflict, the conflict actually might be more preferential to the Americans than one would expect. And their goal is, my personal belief is, the goal is to destabilize and balkanize China so China can be fully integrated in a kind of liberal, democratic, capitalist, globalist sort of system, which would actually be the fruition of the New World Order. In other words, the complete dominance of the neoliberal, capitalist, corporatist order across the entire planet. That's the New World Order. The globe underneath the boot of transnational corporations and international capital, for the benefit of those already grandfathered into the system, particularly the European and American banking dynasties. But that's an interesting article. But like I said, this has been let me see here. So this is defense news. The Pentagon is planning for war with China and Russia. Can it handle both? So this is from the defense news. It's very interesting. 1 minute. Let me do something here. So here we go. So this is the thing too, is that based off of what I'm saying, rather than seeing Russia and China as different, see them as the same. So you're not actually wasting your time by confronting Russia, let's just say the weaker pressure point within this larger Sino-Russian alliance, which is what it naturally is. You know what I'm saying? Like it's so we're not wasting time. We actually, like I said, we gained some chess moves by getting Finland and Sweden. Poland is more armed. I think we have B Corps or something in Poland right now. I forget the camp's name. It's a camp Polish name, but there's tons of American troops there now. Who would have thought? Inching even more to the eastern, to like moving more east in Europe, American forces, right? We got Orland air base in Norway, which is a Norwegian air base that hosts the F-35. You know what I'm saying? I don't think that the Ukraine battle, the Ukraine war, in the larger pretext to an unfortunate larger world war potentially, it is a waste of time. And the Ukrainians bravely fought for us. So what do we do to repay them? You know, when people pulled out of Afghanistan and then they were saying, oh, we left the interpreters behind and all this type of stuff and screw Biden. I'm just starting to realize that this is what I'm saying. This military space is just hostile to the Democratic Party. I'm sorry, the YouTuber bro military space is just hostile to the Democratic Party. Because the conservatism has largely won the narrative of painting Democrats as the establishment, the Clintons, Hillary, all that type of stuff. But I don't think we wasted our time here. And yes, did we get some actual like research from this situation? To Andrew's point, absolutely. But it's not a blunder. It's impossible to call it a blunder because this is just a part of something larger going on right now. And it's something that's not going to be done for a while, a larger global conflict. And like I said, so it means right here, right? Let me read a little bit. So the Pentagon is planning for war with China and Russia. Can it handle both? By Aaron Mehta. So the Pentagon is opening gates for redesigning the force around the challenges of Russia and China. The department's number 2 uniformed official said Tuesday, while warning that America may not be able to afford preparing for 2 unique problem sets. So the recent national defense strategy identified great power competitors as the major challenge facing the Pentagon. But General Paul Silva, vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, noted that the plans required to counter each nation are naturally in tension with one another for resources. Here's why they will be in competition with each other. They are not the same. Silva explaining during an event hosted by Defense Writers Group. There are 2 unique competitors that we have to deal with, and the elements are overlapping but not the same. The primary way the tension plays out depends on who would be involved in the fight. Any fight with China, if it were to come to blows, would be largely maritime and air fight. So this is the whole like not land sea battle, but I think it's I forgot the whole new the strategy of it. But yeah, the Air Force and the Navy are going to play a huge role in the Pacific. So it doesn't mean the Army and the Marine Corps don't have a place. But when you think about how a potential conflict with China would evolve, it very likely involves a substantial contribution from naval and air forces, and the Army and Marine Corps would be supporting elements in that fight. In contrast, the Russia global problem set is largely an air and ground fight, supported by elements of our maritime component because you can't get to Russia, you can't get to Europe in any large measure without transiting the North Atlantic, he said, which means there's going to be a maritime fight to get to the continent, but the fight itself as it evolves is likely to be an air and ground war. Silva noted that in the national defense strategy, Russia is identified as global challenge, a deliberate move by the planners' part to try to move away from the idea that Russia is primarily a challenge for Europe to deal with. Interesting. So they're calling them a global challenge to move away from the idea that Russia is primarily a challenge for Europe to deal with. So why is retracting from the European continent in our best interest then? So, of course, there are other threats to the U.S. besides Russia and China. In recent strategy documents, the Pentagon narrowed its focus to what it calls the 4+1 threats, which are Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and terrorism. North Korea is the easier to plan for, Silva noted, as Pyongyang derives almost all of its military capabilities from buying hardware from either Russia or China, which means planning for the two peer competitors. Which means planning for the two peer competitors covers the rogue nuclear state. So Iran, however, is more complicated, Silva said, because the geography in Iran is so compellingly different than what we will probably develop because the geography in Iran is so compellingly different that we will probably develop some capabilities. I can't tell you what they are at this instant for Iran that are decidedly different than for Russia or China. Very interesting. So affordability. So as a result of the focus on great power competition, Silva is working to build out a global campaign plan for both Russia and China, looking across the breadth of the U.S. military before assigning a combatant commander as the coordinating authority for management of the plan in case a conflict arises, but figuring out which is the likeliest scenario and how to invest accordingly are major challenges being worked out inside the Pentagon. Silva indicated that those challenges will be part of the upcoming national military strategy, expected to be completed before the end of the year, but the question of having enough funding to prepare for both is clearly on Silva's mind. So this is an article written in 2018 even. So like I said, the idea of fighting both has been on the Pentagon's mind for a while. And I would actually argue that even though they're seeing China and Russia as different, you can almost kind of see them as a united Eurasian force, basically mass, a kinetic, a type of kinetic force or whatever from Eurasia, basically. That's what I would consider this whole thing to be. So to my point, you deal with the lower hanging fruit of Russia, but right now the debate is do you keep the pressure off, particularly with the United States helping with the pressure, when in theory I don't think that we lost this war. And I don't think Ukraine lost land and territory, which is horrible, which is terrible for them and everything like that. But it's honestly they're never going to get that land back. They're never going to get that land back. However, like I said, we gained some countries in NATO. So we'll see where the whole Zelensky-Trump deal goes, because Zelensky basically said he wants security guarantees. So what is a security guarantee? Is it full admittance into NATO? I mean, it should be interesting. But regardless, I just don't 100% agree with the style that Andrew Bustamante presented in the video. I think he has good points and everything like that. However, it's like he's saying the real threat is China and Taiwan. Is it? I mean, it is, but why is that any less of a threat than Ukraine? Like, why are we picking one or the other when really you can say that maybe they're just the same? Maybe the same criticality, the same urgency is in both. And to my points, whereas that America has exercised for both. You know what I'm saying? So like maybe the Army and the Air Force need to get more crunk in Europe, and the Navy and the Air Force needs to get more crunk in the Pacific. But at the end of the day, it's like I don't think it was a waste of time. In this whole notion that like Ukraine is some like is necessarily an inherently corrupt country, it's kind of jacked up. Like why shouldn't they not allow to be in the West? If this were the Cold War and if Ukraine had the chance to have joined NATO or the West, the Republicans would have been all over it. But now they don't want it. It's just kind of subjective what's going on here. And I think that this kind of note that I was writing will better clarify some of my positions. So I'm just going to end the video right there. And like I said, I'll leave some of these links in the post if you want to read them. So thank you and take care. All right, peace.